On August 25th, 2025, the world was shaken when Nasser Hospital in Khan Younis, southern Gaza, once considered a humanitarian safe zone, became the target of a highly controversial military strike. In just a few short minutes, 2 shells from Israeli tanks turned a place of healing into the focal point of international diplomatic, legal, and media confrontation. The incident did not remain confined to the battlefield, but quickly became a major test for the global order. Can international humanitarian law still protect people? Or are those red lines gradually being erased in the smoke and fire of modern warfare? In modern warfare, the question is not only about military tactics, but also about protecting those regarded as humanitarian shields, journalists and medical workers. The strike on Nasser Hospital killed at least 20 people, including Hussam al-Masri, a Reuters cameraman, along with 4 other journalists from AP, Al Jazeera, NBC, and Middle East Eye. According to international news agencies and WHO, al-Masri died while filming from the upper floor. Video from Al Ghad TV captured a man holding a blood-stained flak jacket and camera believed to be al-Masri's, waving to the crowd below before placing them on the tiled ground. Footage from the scene showed rescue teams and reporters gathering at the emergency exit after the first blast. About 7 to 15 minutes later, another explosion struck that very area. Witnesses described how just a few minutes of signal sending turned into chaos. Reporter Haydam Omar, 42 years old, recalled, "I was climbing the stairs with colleagues when the second blast occurred." Hospital director Mohammed Zakaut said that around 10 in the morning, the first blast struck while doctors, patients, and interns were at work. An international doctor described the scene as panic blood everywhere, the medical staff working under extreme stress also confirming that the hospital's emergency staircase was damaged. WHO stated that many medical workers considered evacuation, but most patients could not be moved since this was the largest medical facility in the area. This event not only caused heavy casualties, but also sounded the alarm about the fragility of international humanitarian norms. For when journalists cannot report safely, truth is hard to verify, and when medical staff cannot operate independently, civilian lives are directly at risk. Thus, each strike on these two groups is not only a tragic event, but also shakes faith in the enforceability of international conventions. The issue here is not who is right, who is wrong, but the lesson in modern conflict: every rule only has real value when there is an effective mechanism of protection. Otherwise, the document signed in Geneva or New York will remain only on paper. Israel's response revealed a familiar dilemma in modern warfare, having to admit mistakes to preserve credibility, while at the same time seeking to protect the legitimacy of the military campaign. Israeli officials insisted the target was surveillance equipment, but at the same time admitted there were gaps in the approval process. This was an effort to balance technical explanations with maintaining political image. In its preliminary report, the IDF stated that a Golani brigade unit detected a Hamas camera on the hospital roof, decided to fire, then launched a second shot to ensure the target was destroyed. Israeli officials did not explain why the 2 shots were minutes apart instead of fired continuously, nor did they answer whether they saw journalists and medical staff at the scene when deciding to strike. According to Haaretz, the Israeli tank fired at what was believed to be the camera, then decided to fire again to make sure the target was destroyed. The army also admitted there were gaps in the approval process and in field decision-making. After the incident, Prime Minister Netanyahu called it a tragic accident, affirming that Israel would launch an investigation, but the statement did not mention the follow-up fire tactic, the very point that drew the most international concern. For the international community, the decisive factor does not lie in statements or words, but in the degree of transparency and real accountability. In the context of a tightly connected global media, even small mistakes can be magnified into major questions about the legality of a campaign. Therefore, the issue does not stop at investigating the incident, but also lies in whether oversight procedures and accountability mechanisms are strong enough to prevent similar events from recurring. This very question opens a wider discussion in protracted conflicts. How can one side both maintain military strategy and preserve international confidence in its compliance with humanitarian law? This is not only Israel's problem, but a shared challenge for all nations at war in the 21st century. Hamas's response highlighted another front of modern warfare, the information front. By rejecting accusations and claiming Israel fabricated excuses, Hamas not only protected its own image, but also sought to gain advantage in the battle over the narrative before the international public. A member of Hamas's political wing, Bassem Naim, stressed even if there really was a camera, Israel had many ways to neutralize it without shelling a medical facility. He called Israel's argument a fabrication aimed at evading legal and moral responsibility. Thus, the struggle here was not only a military event, but also a battleground of discourse, where every statement was aimed at global opinion. This reflected a reality in today's conflicts. Controlling the narrative has power equal to controlling territory. Each side seeks to redefine truth in ways that benefit itself, thereby influencing global opinion, international organizations, as well as allies and adversaries. Therefore, each declaration is not just a rebuttal, but part of a long-term strategy to build or safeguard legitimacy. Seen more broadly, this incident showed that information warfare has become a new layer of the battlefield where images, words, and data are exploited as weapons. And at times, its impact on public opinion and policy lasts even longer than what happens on the actual battlefield. The international response to the attack showed a sharp division. The United Nations and the World Health Organization immediately spoke out, stressing that medical staff and civilians must always be given absolute protection. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called it a horrific massacre. From Europe, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer described the action as indefensible, while French President Emmanuel Macron declared it unacceptable. In contrast, the response from the United States was rather cautious. President Donald Trump merely stated that he was not satisfied but offered no tough measures. This difference raised the question, why was the West so reserved? First, because of security and alliance constraints, especially the deep strategic ties between the US and Israel, which made every statement require careful consideration. Second, domestic political factors and divided public opinion forced governments, especially Washington, to use toned-down language to avoid sparking further crises at home. And finally, there was also concern about legal risks and precedents. If judgments were made too hastily, Western nations could bind themselves to legal and diplomatic responsibilities in other conflicts around the world. The UN Human Rights Office, through spokesman Tamim Al-Khitan, also emphasized that the deaths of many journalists in Gaza posed a serious question whether Israel deliberately targeted reporters and why previous investigations had not produced specific accountability. OHU confirmed that Nasser Hospital's emergency staircase had been damaged, noting that many medical workers had considered evacuation, but most patients could not be moved since this was the largest facility in the area. From this, it could be seen that the European Union chose strong wording to assert the role of guardian of humanitarian values, while the US reacted cautiously to preserve its strategic relationship with Israel. This gap showed that politics and interests shaped the level of response, not purely the humanitarian principles they often emphasized. The tactic of double strikes was not the first phenomenon to appear in Gaza. According to the Israeli magazine Plus 972, in an article published in July 2025, the practice of firing two space shots had become the standard operational procedure of the Israel Defense Forces in Gaza. This tactic had been used in many campaigns to increase the ability to destroy the target. This further fueled concerns that the incident at Nasser Hospital was not just an isolated accident, but reflected a dangerous pattern in the execution of tactics, where the line between military targets and civilian safety was sometimes blurred. Not only that, on June 17th, Palestinian health officials reported that Israeli tanks had fired on a crowd waiting for aid in Khan Younis, killing 59 people and injuring 221. Witnesses described thousands gathering to receive food when the tanks fired at least two shells, creating a tragic scene of chaos. The Israel Defense Forces expressed regret for civilian casualties, but insisted the action was to ensure the safety of soldiers as the crowd approached a stranded aid truck on the road. Images circulated on social media showed dozens of bodies lying across the main road, one of the bloodiest scenes since the beginning of the war. The United Nations criticized the current aid distribution system as dangerous and a violation of humanitarian principles, while Israel argued it was necessary to prevent Hamas interference. Placing the two events side by side, June 17th's aid convoy and August 25th's Nasser Hospital revealed a troubling reality. International humanitarian boundaries were being broken, even those regarded as requiring absolute protection. Civilians seeking food, along with medical staff and journalists, were not safe. Yet Western reactions remained cautious, partly because Western governments were bound by strategic relations with Israel, partly because the regional context was even hotter with the volleys of missiles exchanged between Israel and Iran, pushing Gaza down in broader political priorities. The strike on Nasser Hospital was no longer a single battlefield incident, but became a global symbol of controversy over the limits of humanitarian law in modern warfare. Israel insisted it was a necessary act to eliminate a security threat, while much of the international community viewed it as evidence of violations against the protection of civilians, medical staff, and the press. And this very opposition, Israel calling it an accident, the European Union condemning strongly, yet the US and much of the West remaining silent or cautious, showed that international humanitarian boundaries can easily be bent by strategic calculations. That is why the West does not say much, or says, but does not act. From a lessons perspective, there are three key points. First, transparency of information is the prerequisite to easing tensions and maintaining trust among the parties. Second, international humanitarian law only has value when tied to independent and effective monitoring mechanisms rather than just existing on paper. Third, in today's world, truth and trust carry weight equal to and sometimes even greater than military power. A campaign may succeed technically, but it will be hard to sustain if it loses the trust of global public opinion. On a broader scale, this incident raised a question beyond Gaza, and today's world nations compete not only with weapons, but also with diplomacy and information. So what truly determines the strength of a nation? The arsenal it holds, the ability to control the flow of information, or the trust it builds with the international community? Share your thoughts in the comments below if you found this analysis useful. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to keep following in-depth content on global politics and current affairs. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video.